All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, thanks everyone for joining us today for the first in a series of Western Governors Species Conservation and ESA Initiative Year 2 webinars. Today's webinar is titled Collaborative Species Conservation in the Southeast. My name is Zach Bodane. I'm a policy advisor for wildlife at the Western Governors Association. First of all, if you're in need of any technical assistance, please message me through the WebEx application or call WGA at 303-623-9378. Again, that's 303-623-9378. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to describe quickly a little bit about the Western Governors Species Conservation and ESA Initiative and go over a few logistical details for the webinar. So, as I'm sure some of you are aware, we're now entering the second year of the Species Conservation and ESA Initiative. The first year included a very expansive, broad look at species conservation efforts in the ESA, including 4 workshops across the West, a series of webinars, numerous questionnaires. So our goal in the second year is to try to dive down into a bit more detail and also expand the focus of the initiative outside of just the West and try to take on a more national perspective and a more national look at ESA. So I think this is the perfect way to to start off the second year of the initiative. So for those of you that may not be too familiar with it, a little bit about the initiative. It was the chairman's initiative of Governor Matt Mead of Wyoming, who was WGA chair last year. Through the initiative, we're trying to create a framework for states and industry to share best practice in species management. We're trying to promote and elevate the role of states in species conservation efforts, and finally looking for ways to improve the efficacy of the ESA. So to put it simply, really what we're trying to do through this is just examine ESA and species conservation efforts and figure out what's working and what isn't. So that's a little bit of background about the initiative. As for the logistics for this specific webinar, happy to be joined by our moderator, Cindy Dohner. She is the Southeastern Regional Director for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'll let her and the panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but how the webinar is going to run, each panelist will deliver brief opening remarks. Following those remarks, we're going to turn to a moderated discussion amongst panelists. So Cindy will be moderating a discussion amongst all of our panelists, and we'll ask a few questions of them to get things started. After the moderated discussion, we'll have an open question and answer session for all attendees. All attendees are currently on mute, so you'll have to use the chat function to send your question. To use that, please write your question in the chat box at the bottom right of your screen, and be sure that you have addressed or selected the option to address your chat directly to me, Zach Bodane, or use the Q&A box at the farthest bottom right. We will be recording today's webinar. Our goal is to have it available probably early next week. And again, if you need technical assistance, please message me or call WGA at 303-623-9378. So with all that being said, I will now hand things over to our moderator, Cindy.
Thank you, Zach, and good morning to everybody. I'd like to thank the Western Governors Association for inviting us to present the Southeast effort for this collaborative species conservation. And I'm assuming that we want to introduce all of our speakers. So again, my name is Cindy Dohner, Regional Director. Thank you, Zach.
Mike Harris, At-Risk Species Coordinator for the Southeast Region, Fish and Wildlife Service.
Jimmy Bullock, Senior Vice President for Forest Sustainability for Resource Management Service.
Salem Saloom, Private Landowner, South Alabama.
Gordon Myers, Executive Director of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission.
Todd Ewing. Wiley.
Go ahead, Nick.
Nick Wiley, Executive Director of Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and President of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies.
And Todd Ewing, Aquatic Wildlife Diversity Program Supervisor for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and Vice Chair of the Seattle Wildlife Diversity Committee.
All right, thank you, everybody. So I'm going to give you just a brief background. Again, this is Cindy Dohner. So starting in 2010, between a couple of petitions and a legal settlement, the Southeast region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to determine the status of more than 450 fish, wildlife, and plant species under the Endangered Species Act. This was the multi-district litigation, which was settled under a court order of settlement in 2011, a mega petition of 404 aquatic or aquatic-dependent species, and another petition we received to evaluate reptiles and amphibians. In total, that was 60% of the national workload, and at this time, it's still 60% of the national workload. There was a lot of discussion within the Fish and Wildlife Service to try and figure out how to address this unprecedented workload. Our goal was to work with the states first, and then anyone and everyone on the landscape through voluntary actions that would conserve species to preclude the need to list them under the Endangered Species Act while ensuring working land stayed working. When I talk about at-risk species, I mean those species that are facing threats to their survival, and specifically the ones that were part of these petitions in this legal settlement, which are proposed species, candidate species, or petition species under the Endangered Species Act. In some cases, we do work on other priority state species, like state-listed species or species of concern, but right now the focus in the Southeast is on the settlement and these petitions. As the regional director for the Southeast region, I first visited with the state directors from the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or SIAFWA. That's 15 southeastern states, to discuss this challenge because they had jurisdiction over these at-risk species. There was no federal jurisdiction over many of them. As a result, we embarked on the Southeast At-Risk Species Program to address this unprecedented workload with the states, who now have taken the lead. The effort undertaken to address unknowns or the threats included surveys to look for new populations, research that needed to be done, voluntary conservation on the ground, and working across jurisdictional boundaries through a landscape scale approach that we hadn't done in the past. We also needed to figure out, the service needed to figure out how to use the flexibilities within the ESA better that would allow us to provide assurances or regulatory predictability for private landowners, industries, and those states that were working with us as we were going forward to conserve at-risk species. Land ownership in the Southeast is mostly state and private landowners, ranging from anywhere from 80% of the individual state to more than 90% in some instances. We also reached out to other federal agencies in the Southeast through the Southeast Natural Resource Leaders Group, which are 14 different federal agencies. But then we also started reaching out to, like I said, everybody, industry, private landowners, and other organizations to be part of this effort. To date, I can say we have been able to preclude the need to list more than 93 species and had 13 other wildlife wins. What I mean by wildlife wins are either downlistings, delistings. Some species still need to be listed, but because of conservation actions, we were able to list them as threatened with the 4D rule that allowed flexibility, again, under the Endangered Species Act. So that's a little bit about where we're at, why we got here. And what I'd like to do is hand the presentation to Gordon Myers, the Executive Director for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, next, to have him give a few words.
Thank you, Cindy, and Zach, thank you and the Western Governors Association. This whole initiative is really neat to be a part of, and so I'm grateful for the opportunity this morning. As Cindy described, the Southeast region has truly faced an unprecedented listing petition. More than 450 species all came in one slug, and that surge created a tremendous sense of urgency across the Southeast, and it was clear that business as usual would not be able to cut it and satisfactorily. And we had to stop doing things the same way if we really wanted to achieve different results. And so the approach that emerged based on that sense of urgency has been very coordinated, focused, and integrated. It has also been strategic and tactical as needed. And the Southeast states and the federal partners are working in a coordinated fashion with a strategy to conserve wildlife species and their habitats across large landscapes. There's a large landscape focus working across their entire ranges, regardless of territorial jurisdictions, which is key. And this landscape approach is also key to assuring that the petition evaluations integrate the best available science, including habitat and species monitoring and status data. So there's a timeliness component that's really important in that as well. And to be very clear, all of this work has been done without losing sight that the states remain the primary jurisdiction over those priority species. And so we're very focused on priority species and timely delivery. And we've also been responding with that sense of urgency and tactically by establishing systems such as a triage process to prioritize the collective action across the region. That triaging is very important, and I think it'll be discussed in greater detail by Mike and Todd. We've integrated processes by pooling our financial resources and our human resources across the region, which helps us more optimally address these challenges. And after all, we're all working with very finite and constrained resources, and those are our human resources, our financial resources, as well as state and federal process constraints. And so that optimization becomes very relevant to address such a tidal wave of need. And I think one of the bottom lines and what truly resonates as a steward of wildlife and financial resources of our state is that we are working more efficiently and effectively than if each state were to simply work in a series of one-to-one interactions with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think this collective approach is far more successful at achieving effectiveness. And by being coordinated, focused, and integrated, I think we're really making a difference overall. And I think Cindy mentioned the proof in those results. More than 100 species have been precluded from listing or downlisted in this process. And so what began as a coordinated effort to unify resources to address a clear and present challenge has also led to a new way of doing business across the Southeast. And I want to touch on a couple key and notable outgrowths of our work together. Again, spurred from that sense of urgency in that monumental listing petition, partners across the Southeast developed tools such as the Southeast At-Risk Species Program, or SEERS, and the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS. And each of these tools has brought more structure and more organization to the concepts of working at a landscape scale, and that, I think, is key. CCAS is a state-led effort that provides an important interface also with the self-directed landscape conservation cooperatives. And that's very important to the states. It helps to coordinate and unify our efforts, and it's helping to ensure that the LCCs are aligning well with our state priorities and our wildlife action plans. But it also provides important continuity or common currency across states and broader regions, particularly those states that have multiple LCCs falling within their jurisdictions. This helps provide that common currency across the state. These innovations will continue to help us work efficiently into the future, and my hope is it will foster proactive conservation of our at-risk species, which will inevitably avoid undue regulation down the road. So in closing, I would also stress that I think success requires building trust in our relationships. When we stepped out and tried this new approach, we had to trust our partners, and I think that's a key component of success, is to build the trust in your relationships. And with that, that's it for me for my opening remarks. So again, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this.
Next, we have Nick Wiley, the Executive Director for Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Cindy and Zach and all of you folks at Western Governors. Again, I echo the thanks for the attention to this, and I do think this is a great discussion to have. I just want to follow through on a lot of what Gordon said and add that one thing we recognize too in this and where our partnership across states and with the Fish and Wildlife Service has really helped is bringing in the other really critical players in this, and that is our landowners, our private lands, our timber companies, and those folks out there that actually own the land and are very, very much a critical part of finding solutions. And I'm seeing that really come together and grow, and it's changing. This process, all of us working together, is changing the tone from kind of concerned and uncertainty and and where are things going, and this is, you know, this is going to be a bad thing, to let's work together to get through this together and adapt and learn and make darn sure we keep working landscapes working, and that's a critical piece of this. Also, as Gordon noted, we've got these umbrella programs where we're all working to coordinate, but then when you drill down, there's a lot of really important stuff going on down in the states that ties into this. A lot of states are really upping their game on developing imperiled species management plans and focusing on, it's not about how you characterize or classify a particular species, it's about how you manage it and how you work with everybody to manage that species and address any risks or threats. So those management plans are really critical. And then when you drill down too is, you know, how do the states pay for these things and how do the states move these things forward? We're often very limited, as Gordon said, and I can't stress enough the importance of our state wildlife grants program for dealing with species that are important at the state level and that are under our, you know, our jurisdiction at this point. Those state wildlife grant funding programs are so critical, and honestly right now it's a triage approach, and the money's really only enough to go through a triage approach. We're hopeful down the road that we can get more funds to flow through this program. We can talk more about that later, but there's a lot going on at the state level, working with our landowners, working with our federal partners, and this is it's encouraging, and I think we're at a point where we're learning how to work better, not just with our federal partners, but across state lines with each other, and that's a critical piece of this as well. So thank you, Cindy, and everybody on the panel and everybody that's listening in, and look forward to more discussion.
Thank you, Nick. Next, we have Dr. Salem Saloom. He's an Alabama landowner. Salem?
Thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you, everyone, for allowing me as a private landowner to be a part of this webinar and discussion. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. We, as a private landowner, have a 2,200-acre tree farm that we manage hands-on, about 99% of us doing all the work. And we're located in the upper coastal plains of South Alabama. We have transitioning over to longleaf since 2004 Hurricane Ivan, and this past December, a little more than a month ago, or less than a month ago, we planted our 1,000th acre of longleaf, which we are managing with prescribed fire. We've been on a prescribed fire burning program for since 1990. We're doing more growing season burns right now, which is complementing all of our woodlands. There, the next slide, please. Our primary threatened species is the gopher tortoise. We're intensively managing and restoring that habitat. Back in July 2013, we signed an MOU with Fish and Wildlife under their Partners Pilot Program. It was a 30-year MOU that we've committed. It is early on incentive-based. This MOU encompassed about 155 acres of young longleaf. The incentive basis was to help us get some TSI work done for controlling with herbicide and mid-story hardwood. We ourselves are doing the rest of the management and work, that being invasive species control and prescribed fire. We have a 3 to 4 year cycle of prescribed fire that we're committing to, but our prescribed fire regimen is around 2 to 3 years. Many landowners would frown on a 30-year commitment. Voluntary cooperative conservation is imperative in helping to prevent listing. So let's go to the next slide, please. Brian Seashows was formerly with the Reason Foundation as a policy analyst, and he wrote a well-written article titled "An Old Blueprint for 21st Century Conservation." I think it's appropriate for our conversation today just to kind of highlight some of these points that he made. And specifically, he listed 6 realities for conserving our country's land, water, and wildlife. And I'm going to list those 6 realities. They're listed there, but I'm going to expand on them just slightly. 60% of U.S. privately land is owned, of the U.S. is privately owned land. And as we discussed earlier, about 80% in the Southeast is privately owned. High value diversity is mainly in private ownership. Conservation requires hands-on management. You know, you just can't let nature take its course. And my dictum is, and I know most of you think the same way, the more management one does, the more one tends to do. One of the third realities is conservation is a long-term endeavor. It takes years and even decades to see the fruition of that conservation work. Conservation needs to be flexible. We need to practice adaptive management. Private landowners are the longest installed base of conservationists. Many private landowners live on the land, they're intimately involved in the land. And the sixth reality is that data reveals that landowners prefer conservation programs based on incentives and cooperation instead of penalties and compulsion. Next slide, please. So private landowners have a strong stewardship ethic. Landowners are concerned about risks to property values and livelihoods associated with protecting endangered species. And landowners prefer to have their own authority in management and decisions. Therefore, hands-on management by private landowners and resource users is important in effective conservation. And this command and control conservation really destroys relationships and is counterproductive. This partnership relationship is extremely important if we are going to necessitate effective conservation and management in keeping species from being listed. We as private landowners need to be at the table. We need to be at the table when rules and incentives and policy are being discussed. Private landowners need to be involved in membership organizations such as the American Forest Foundation, the Longleaf Alliance in the Southeast, Tree Farm, other state organizations that are extremely important in helping to connect private landowners with fish and wildlife conversations. AFF, the American Forest Foundation, is engaging landowners across the landscapes in our Southern Initiative regional work. The work is promoting more sustainable wood fiber and improved wildlife habitat with focus on at-risk species by landowner management of their family woodlands. Next slide, please. The most least expensive management tool we have at our disposal is that of prescribed fire, and we have our greatest results with that. Increased landowner to landowner prescribed fire management, promoting more prescribed fire on private lands is essential. We need to continue to sell the benefits of prescribed fire to society as well. Those benefits, few of them, reducing fuel loads will have greater outcomes in reducing wildfires. It improves wildlife habitat, it improves water quality and quantity. Just to sidelight the Western regional landscape work that the American Forest Foundation is doing with partners as an impetus, its impetus is reducing wildfires and increasing water quality and quantity for 22 million people across regional and across boundaries and across private land ownership and Forest Service federal lands. That is important. And we need to find innovative ways to reduce the liability cost. Next slide, please. We need to find innovative ways to provide funding for a broader array of issues, such as we need win-win situations and approaches that are mutually beneficial. We need to continue to have think tanks and more discussions and people thinking out of the box in coordination. Society needs to understand the benefits that our woodlands have for them, clean air and water, wildlife, less regulations, and jobs. Last slide, please. Difficult to read, but I'll read it. This is by Aldo Leopold. The relationship of people to the land and the relationship of people to each other. This relationship has everything to do with restoration. Relationships are the key. We all need to be proactive in building and maintaining those relationships between landowners, agencies, biologists, and managers. This is why, as a private landowner, I am engaged with Fish and Wildlife. I cannot overstate the importance of this relationship, as we, as private landowners, need to retain control of managing our forest lands. It becomes all of our responsibility to work together to effect improved conservation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salem. I appreciate that. Next, we have Jimmy Bullock. He's the Senior Vice President for Forest Sustainability Resource Management Service.
Thank you, Cindy, and thanks to the Western Governors for the invitation. I'm really here today on behalf of the National Alliance of Forest Owners, or NAFO. NAFO is the umbrella organization for large landowners, particularly real estate investment trust and timber investment management organizations, but also large family ownerships across the U.S. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about NAFO. It is based in D.C. It is our primary advocacy group, but really the members of NAFO are focused on value from working forest, and that's a change from the integrated ownership days of International Paper and Georgia Pacific and other who formerly owned a lot of these lands to leverage the cost of raw material into their manufacturing facilities. Next slide, please. Why are we involved? Why have we started this initiative? Well, certainly, as has been mentioned, the catalyst is all of the evaluations the Fish and Wildlife Service has been asked and obligated to do, 450-plus species and counting. And when we look at those, many are dependent on actively managed forest land or riparian and aquatic habitats. And if you look at this quote from Cindy, it's very evident why we started in Region 4, because Cindy gets it, and Cindy's team in the region get it. You know, private landowners are great stewards, want to be involved in conservation, and really are open to voluntary and innovative measures, and I think that's really important and a key. Next slide, please. We really came together initially as a small group of NAFO members. About 5 companies came to Cindy and some of her team, and the idea that we came to her with was that working forest can and will help conserve at-risk and listed species, particularly those found in young forest, open canopy, riparian, and aquatic habitats. And that from that initial meeting and a couple of pilot projects, we've really taken this into a national initiative across all regions that have NAFO membership. And we have agreed as an organization and as the member companies to work proactively in this, and that we can use certification as kind of a tool for demonstrating certainty. But the real key, and this has already been mentioned, it's trust, relationships, and true partnership, and I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. What, I think we skipped one, yeah. What do we bring to the table? First of all, we're bringing 50 million acres of member-owned forest land. So really, I think it's probably unprecedented that a stakeholder segment, 50 million acres across the U.S., would come to the service and voluntarily say we want to be part of the solution and we want to have our lands and our acres involved. A requirement of NAFO membership is to demonstrate sustainability. Almost all members do that through third-party certification. And we also have linkages to other organizations, the American Forest Foundation, the Forest Landowners Association, state forestry associations that literally bring in tens of thousands of other landowners and millions of other privately owned forest land. And we also have a tie to NCASI, National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, which allows us to aggregate information across the landscape and really is the strong research arm for forestry and the forestry sector. Next slide, please. I did want to touch briefly on forest certification because it can help give the service certainty of management practices. If we enter into voluntary proactive agreements, those agreements can be part of the third-party audit process. There are 3 creditable third-party certification systems in the U.S., the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, the American Tree Farm System, the Forest Certification System. And really with any of these certification systems, best management practices for water quality become mandatory. On-the-ground management practices for at-risk species, management plans for those species, memorandums of agreement with state agencies, such as many of us have with Florida on gopher tortoise, become auditable practices, and it really can give independent verification and certainty. Next slide, please. We did start in Region 4, and it's not an accident that we did that, primarily because, as Cindy already mentioned, most of the region is in private ownership, and the service has a long and proven history of engaging and building trust with the private sector. And that is the real key to making things happen. And the other thing, perhaps not unique to this region, but I think this region is the prototype for it. The region will look for innovative paths to species conservation. And for the private sector, finding solutions that meet the problem as opposed to trying to squeeze something into a regulatory box is huge. And it's difficult to see the slide on the right, but to me this really gets to where we're trying to go. This is the state of Alabama. The areas in yellow are where the Fish and Wildlife Service field office in Alabama has highlighted for conservation work because of the huge number of at-risk species in those yellow areas. There's an overlay of my company's land base, and the Alabama field office has already picked out areas for surveys, for reintroduction of at-risk species, particularly aquatics, for doing things around riparian habitat protection for map turtles, and getting on to conservation measures for larger critters like the gopher tortoise. And when you can share your land base with the service and tailor activities to conserve species, that's the true win. And that just shows that it's important to communicate at the national level, at the region level, but getting down to the field office level, it truly shows how this can work. Next slide, please. You know, what is success for us? Really, it's recognizing that working forests are part of the conservation solution, that together the service and private landowners become advocates for this type of approach, that for us, listing decisions recognize the benefits of working forests. It may help the service decide not to list a species if the species is listed through either a 4D rule or the listing. Forestry may be clearly identified as not a threat, or if there's a 4D rule, the species is listed as threatened, and if there's an innovative 4D rule, it may actually promote forest management. So we see a lot of opportunities. For the service, this aligns very well with the strategic habitat conservation vision, landscape focus, conservation with willing partners, adaptive management framework, and basing it all in good science. Next slide, please. Gordon and Nick, I didn't want you to think that we're doing this in a vacuum, because we certainly realize the states have primary responsibility for at-risk species, and we've started sharing this initiative with the states in the southeast through the SIAFWA meeting last year in Baton Rouge. We spoke to both the forestry and wildlife committees. We have plans to expand those discussions at the region and at the National Association meeting later this year. But absolutely the states have to be a critical partner with us to make it work, and we recognize that, and we're actively trying to get the states involved quickly. Next slide, please. Just to sum this up, we can work together. We can build trust. We can build relationships. We're actively engaged in taking this to all the other Fish and Wildlife Service regions. I know on the West Coast that, you know, going all the way back to the spotted owl days, it's going to take a while to build trust, and we understand that, but we're committed to doing that. We see some species examples, the Louisiana black bear, the northern long-eared bat, where 4D rules really helped turn this around from a private landowner perspective. The Pacific Fisher decision not to list, based largely on large landowner cooperative agreements. This is the kind of path forward we're looking for, and we believe this can and will work. We believe it's the right thing to do. We think open and early dialogue and discussion is going to be very constructive, and we want to include working forest as part of the solution. And I don't know if that's the last slide or not. Next slide. It is. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jimmy. Next, we have Todd Ewing. Todd works for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission and the Aquatic Wildlife Diversity Program. He's also the vice chair for the Wildlife Diversity Committee under SIAFWA, the Southern Fish and Wildlife State Agency Association, and leads the effort, helps lead this effort for the SEERs. Todd?
Thank you, Cindy. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak with you today. And as Cindy and Gordon and others pointed out, the mega petition was the impetus for the states to really start working together. Up until this point, we largely worked independently and with relatively little interaction with each other. So the SIAFWA states and the Fish and Wildlife Service came together and formed the SEERS program, or Southeast At-Risk Species Program. Next slide, please. The first thing we did was develop a fairly detailed work plan. This plan has 5 fundamental objectives, and these 5 objectives really lay out, describe the things that we think are most important for the conservation and management of these species. And you can see them there on the screen. I won't try to read all those, and I'll speak more about each of these as we go along. Next slide, please. With so many species to deal with, we obviously had to prioritize what we needed to work on. So we ranked species into 4 groups, which you can see there on your screen. About a fifth of these species we thought were immediately ready for action, whether it be some conservation action, getting information to the service, that sort of thing, and would lead to the species being withdrawn from the petition or a not warranted decision. The next category, about a fifth of the species fell into that as well. These were species that we just needed some more information on. Then we had another group that are what we call the unknowns, species that we know virtually nothing about. We know little about their distribution or what their status actually is. And then the last group, the ones that we think likely do warrant listing under the ESA, and about a little over 10% of our species fell into that group. And there were several that we just couldn't classify due to differences of opinion among the states, that sort of thing. And of course, which category we put these species in dictated what actions that we apply or will apply to those species. Next slide, please. One of the things we quickly realized was that we need to do a better job sharing data both between the states and with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we've done several things that we think have led to better communication, better data sharing. Most of the states in the SIAFWA have signed formal data sharing agreements that basically say our data is their data, and this helps during status assessments, especially when a species is first petitioned, they have access to our data now. States were also encouraging each other to participate in the service's new Species Status Assessment, or SSA, process. In the past, it always seemed a little bit like a black hole, how the service and others gathered information for a listing. This new SSA process pulls in states and other partners and encourages interested and knowledgeable parties to come together and give what they know, tell what we know. And the last thing we're doing, we're actively writing up status assessments for those species that we think probably don't warrant listing at this time, and we're providing those assessments to the service. We're in the process of writing about a dozen of those. One success story along those lines, we submitted an assessment of a species called the New River crayfish, which led to the withdrawal of the petition for that species. Next slide, please. The SIAFWA states have 2 programs that we're utilizing to help collect data on species that occur across multiple states. The first utilizes the Competitive State Wildlife Grant Program. these grants are actually handled by the SIAFWA instead of by the individual states as is traditional. And we're currently funding 2 of those projects. We have a Hellbender project and a green salamander project. A more novel approach that we've adopted, actually we stole it from, or borrowed it from the Neapolis states, it's something they've utilized successfully, is our Sears grant program. In this program, each state in the SIAFWA contributes an equivalence of 2% of its annual state wildlife grant allocation, and these funds are used to fund research on monitoring programs and other projects that may not qualify for competitive state wildlife grants. Examples of this are monitoring programs, which CSWIG typically will not fund. We have 3 of those projects ongoing right now, and one project to note, we have a project that deals with an insect, the rattlesnake master borer moth, and the reason that's relevant is because most state wildlife agencies do not deal directly with insects, but since this is a petition species, we realized there needed to be work done on it, so we funded that project. Next slide, please. We'd like to think we've had several successes so far. I will highlight one, the case of the sickle-fin red horse. Sickle-fin red horse is a large fish found in western North Carolina, northern Georgia, and it has been or was a candidate for listing for several years. And once the Fish and Wildlife Service developed their new SSA process, we decided that this species would be a good candidate to put through that process. And as everybody was in the same room talking about what we know about the species, it quickly became apparent that with some conservation work, this species may not need listing. So with the help of the Fish and Wildlife Service and others, a candidate conservation agreement was signed, which brought together 2 power companies, the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, the states of North Carolina and Georgia, and we've all dedicated either funding and or work that we're going to do on the species. And this formal agreement was enough to convince the Fish and Wildlife Service that this species, in fact, did not warrant listing. Next slide, please. As with any partnership, there are good things, there's some bad things, and we use them to learn lessons. The obvious good things is this process has greatly increased the working relationship between the CFWA states and the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Our working relationship has grown quite a bit since we started this. One of the lessons learned is anytime you're dealing with money, it is a very good idea to have an idea up front what you're committing to. In fact, it turned out some states don't have the capacity to assist with an effort like this, which is fine. It's just something we learn as the process goes forward. And coordination is always difficult when you're dealing with species that cross multiple states, multiple fish and wildlife regions, and in some cases several regional wildlife associations. But a process like this is really has been very, very instrumental in us being able to achieve that coordination. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Todd. Next, we have Mike Harris, who is the at-risk species coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in the Southeast. Mike?
Thanks, Cindy, and good morning, everyone. What I'd like to do is touch a little bit on the flexibility of the Endangered Species Act and some of the components that we use in the Southeast, keeping in mind with a land base that's primarily private lands and with many species and habitats that need active management, we need tools that we can work effectively with private landowners on. And so we have several approaches that we're using to do that. Next slide. We see this as a collaborative process with 3 large components. Todd talked a lot about gathering information to inform decisions about the status of species. So that is an ongoing task, working with the states and others. There's lots of opportunity for partners to contribute information on the biology and status of the species. We're seeking to actively involve states and others in the species status assessment process. And then where we know the conservation measures, we're identifying and implementing conservation actions to improve the status of these species. Next slide. And we're trying to be transparent and make it obvious what the priorities are and where these opportunities exist. And so we have a website where we post lots of information, including the petitions, withdrawals, but we developed a tool called the At-Risk Species Finder that allows anyone to find out which species are in their state, where those species are in the process, if they're petitioned or if they're candidate species or if they've already had a determination made, the lead field office, and also links to all of the decision documents for those species. So you can run queries with this finder. It's really helpful to track our progress and keep the states and other partners engaged. So our effort throughout has been to let people know what we're doing and help them see the opportunities to engage if they're interested. Next slide. We also are using all of the voluntary conservation tools that we know of. Working Lands for Wildlife has been a great success with the NRCS, and that's a nationwide program, but the gopher tortoise is one of the Working Lands for Wildlife species. We have a Partners for Fish and Wildlife pilot project that also use the biological opinion, conference opinion approach to provide predictability to landowners. That's the program that Dr. Salom is a partner in. We have that in Georgia and Alabama. That's been successful. The collaboration with the states, and also the traditional tools like candidate conservation agreements and agreements with assurances as well. Next slide. We have been working with the Department of Defense on a gopher tortoise conservation credit strategy. This is one of the pre-listing conservation approaches, our new policy that has recently been announced. What's exciting about this is that the military installations will be able to make investments to benefit the gopher tortoise that are not immediately adjacent to the installations and be able to get credit for that in the future if the gopher tortoise is listed. In the southeast, as in other parts of the country, military bases support lots of habitat and many important populations of listed and at-risk species. They've been a great partner, and we're really pushing the envelope on developing some new strategies to work with them through this credit strategy, and it will be finalized this quarter. Next slide. Jimmy mentioned the 4D rules and using those for threatened species. So the northern long-eared bat, of course, that was a big help with that species. The black pine snake in the southeast here in Alabama and Mississippi, we developed a 4D rule for that species. And the elfin woods warbler in Puerto Rico, where we're working with partners on shade-grown coffee projects. We have a 4D rule that makes it much easier to implement those. So this is an important tool to consider in the future, and every species that we list as threatened, this will always be part of the process in evaluating the need and the opportunity to implement these rules. Next slide. The forestry pilot projects that Jimmy talked about, we're really looking at how we can capture the benefits of the best management practices that they implement on forest lands, include that information in the assessment of aquatic species. We're also working on ways that we can do management to benefit the gopher tortoise in the working lands environment. Maybe some minor adjustments to management there, and of course tracking those through the certification programs will be part of that process as well. Next slide. And we have a new concept that we're working on with the American Forest Foundation. They recently announced a partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Southern Wildlife at Risk. They're going to be investing $7.5 million in priority landscapes in the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee and Alabama and the coastal plain of Alabama. This will really focus on things they can do to benefit at-risk species. They released a survey and a report this fall, and the survey that they did with private landowners showed that many of the landowners were willing to do things for wildlife if they had incentives, money to help, technical assistance. We're going to try to add some regulatory predictability to this by seeking an agreement with them using that Working Lands for Wildlife and Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service model, so that if landowners are interested, we'll be able to give them some assurances or predictability in addition to the financial assistance. Those are the areas that we're focusing on. As many of the earlier participants talked about, relationships and trust are essential when you're working with private landowners. We have more work to do there, but we're excited about the progress that we've made, and we're looking forward to more work in the future. Next slide. We've had, as several presenters mentioned, 95 species that have not needed to go forward, 43 that were withdrawn from the petition by the petitioners based on information that showed them to be in better shape than was thought when that petition was submitted. And that's thanks to the states for a lot of great work to develop that information. We've had other species that we found to be either not warranted or not substantial, also largely based on additional work. Final slide. We're ready for questions, I think. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mike. So I'd like to thank all the panelists, and that provided a little bit of information about the Southeast Conservation, at-risk conservation strategy for species. As you heard, it was a collaborative approach to conservation that is conserving species, precluding them to be listed under the Endangered Species Act while allowing working lands to be working. We do have a couple questions that I'd like to follow up with some of the presenters if we could. From a state perspective, so Gordon and Nick, if you could tell us a little bit about the biggest influence in establishing a positive working relationship between state and federal agencies across those jurisdictional boundaries and the difference that we've been doing here. Gordon?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. So, you know, I think, I guess if you could you say the question one more time, Cindy?
Yep, if you can talk a little bit about more, you mentioned this shift into thinking about collaborative conservation, and what were some of the biggest actions, or what influenced this change into to have a more positive working relationship across those jurisdictional boundaries with the states, and also an improved relationship with the Fish and Wildlife Service?
Well, I think you know, really it's been, you know, we had this sense of urgency, of course, and we had to try things in new ways. And you know, as Todd mentioned in his presentation, you know, certain processes were in the past a bit of a black box to us in how decisions were being made. And by going through this and setting more structure to it and having a more systematic approach that we were all plugged into together, I think that kind of pulled the curtain back and kind of revealed the inner workings of what we perceived to be a black box, and we've all become part of the solution. And that helped, in turn, establish more and more trust in the process. And to me, that's been a big part of it. Nick, I don't know if you want to add to that in terms of those components.
Yeah, Gordon, and I think it's been interesting to watch. You know, a lot of us have been involved in this for many years, and I think at the state, the things that really built traction. So you got three big worlds here that are coming together: private landowners, the federal Fish and Wildlife Service areas, and then the state. And I think there's just been this growing awakening and awareness that we need to work together, and that we're in it together, and that we've all kind of come at different paces to the table here, and the trust factor that keeps coming forward keeps, you know, that's big, but it's just been this awareness of we're in this together. We're better off if we work together. We, you know, it's not a perfect world. It's not always easy, but there's just this growing understanding. I think the best way to, I heard Jimmy say, Cindy and the team at the Fish and Wildlife Service, they get it. I think the states are getting it, and obviously the landowners are out there saying, hey, we want to be at the table, and we understand our future, we're all tied together. So I think that's just a general overview of why things have started to gel and we've developed traction in the Southeast. It's just a matter of all these pieces coming together.
Well, Cindy, I'd add one more observation is that, I think another key has been that as a group, we continue to start with the question of why. Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to do this? And then also beginning with the answer of yes. That's one of the things that you say often, yes, if. And, when we begin with yes, we can do this as long as there aren't these other impediments. But we start out on the trajectory of yes, and I think that has been extremely helpful.
And Gordon, I want to add another thing. There's this undercurrent and it does go back to the trust too. Some people are like still concerned about who's got authority for what and how we look at the authorities at the state level versus authorities at the federal level versus the ownership authorities and rights as well. And one thing I think has helped us forward is we've kind of said let's not dwell on those issues. Let's not get hung up on those things. Let's respect each other's interests, authorities, rights, and all this. And if we need to talk about it, let's be honest and open about it. But let's not let those kind of things hold us back so much. And I think that's helped.
So I'm going to ask a similar question to Jimmy and Salem about the relationship and the trust and the willingness to come forward to work and whether or not that was an issue and were there challenges as you went forward. And Jimmy, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Okay. Well, certainly I think trust has got to be earned, and in the early days probably were some challenges, but in the Southeast it goes back to the Black Bear Conservation Committee and work to help address conservation of the Louisiana black bear. If you think back to when the spotted owl was listed, the next big proposed listing for a large charismatic megafauna, if you will, was the Louisiana black bear. And literally folks were being flown from Washington State to Louisiana to talk about how the end of the world was going to occur if the bear was listed. And the service, to its credit, listened to the stakeholders, and a guy named Wendell Neal proposed a 4D rule that essentially said if you're managing land in forested condition, you're doing good things for the bear. And the bear was listed. Forest landowners did not sue the service, but rather worked to make the bear an asset. 25 years later, the bear was proposed and indeed is in the process of being delisted. And I think the 4D rule and the willingness of the service to listen was a big part of that. And that brought a lot of credibility in the South. And if you look at very recent decisions, the northern long-eared bat, the service in good faith tried to put forward a 4D rule to help conservation of the bat. There were some things in it that the forestry sector had grave concerns about. Those were raised and addressed during the comment period. The service listened. The final 4D rule was very constructive. And I think just the ability to listen and to adapt is really building that credibility with the service. And I'd say the same thing with states. And certainly I would hope the states and the service are looking to the private landowner sector as being a more willing and trusting partner. I mean, they're private landowners who have grave concerns about working with the service, large and small. But as we find ways to work together creatively, I think a lot of those differences are starting to disappear, and it really does get back to relationships.
Salem, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I just want to echo what Jimmy was saying. The other thing is that, the negative sometimes, unfortunately, seems to outweigh the very positive things that are happening. And from a private landowner standpoint, and I'm thinking in terms of the private landowners that are not really involved too much in the conservation other than their own woodlands and not being involved and have a relationship with Fish and Wildlife, those landowners are very distrustful. And it's not until landowners can have that relationship with people in the service, people that are doing the other on-the-ground work in other agencies, that they can find out they're real people too, and they have the same commonalities and the same goals of trying to conserve their lands and do good stewardship practices. I think that tension is relieved a little bit once those people can get together. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is that someone mentioned about sharing our land base. Well, if that landowner is trying to do a good job, and most people that are trying to do a good job and wanting to work on their lands are eager to learn more about what things they can do better. And that information is available. It's available through online and whatnot and through other organizations, but it's more, if it's hands-on and those people can see what's happening and have an association and a discussion with someone at a field day, or if someone comes and walks their land with them, that trust factor will improve so much. It's a two-way street when that happens. You're learning from the landowner, but the landowner is learning from that other person who's a professional who's walking the land. And if we can find more and more of that, I think it was going to take some of that trust out. We need to continue to promote the positive things that are happening with the relationships that's occurring now between private lands and Fish and Wildlife, and quantify some of that stuff that is out there that is happening. I think it'd be beneficial and people can grab a hold of it a little bit better.
Thank you, Salem. We got a comment that people are wondering what are other things that we did that we didn't mention, and I will tell you, this is Cindy again, that one of the things when we first went to the States is they asked us to be completely transparent regarding all of the species, the priority of the species, and that's the reason that Todd stepped you through that prioritization of that information, because what we did is work closely with them on what species should be next as we go forward with this. Obviously, when we get a petition, we have to deal with them. They weren't necessarily the state species, as I said, and they weren't their priorities to evaluate, but as we work closely together, being totally transparent and working together with them has helped make sure people understand that as we go forward, if there's new stuff that we get, we will bring it right to the table. There'll be no surprises, which is one thing that I think we have to commit to. So when you have surprises, you don't build your trust. So we've tried to be totally transparent, and that was one of the things with the at-risk species finder that was part of Mike Harris's presentation. Mike, do you want to add anything?
Yes. You know, I was with the state when that petition finding was published, the substantial on 374 of those 404. I came over to the service about a year or two later, and looking at it from a state perspective, we were thinking, wow, we have a lot of information. I wish that had been available to the service when they made those substantial findings on that initial petition. And we have not totally solved the information transfer issue, but we've made a lot of progress in having more information available to make decisions. And I think as that information has come to light, that's been a big part of the withdrawals and some of the other findings as we went ahead. And it's very important to be open and collaborative in working on these conservation challenges with the scale that we have.
Thanks, Mike. Some of the other questions that we have is, someone asked about the urgency that Gordon talked about. Was the petitions and the lawsuits that we had that gave us this unprecedented workload. But is there a way to do proactive conservation as we go forward before you get this urgency from these petitions and these lawsuits? So I was wondering if anybody has any ideas, and Jimmy, whether or not working together proactively ahead of these types of things.
Absolutely, and I'd just say that the ability to communicate early will help not only with at-risk species or listed species, but really it helps get ahead of groups of species, whether you're talking about aquatics or something in the longleaf community or the ponderosa pine community or wherever you're at. The ability to sit down with the service, sit down with the states and say, here are some real conservation challenges that include species X, Y, and Z. You know, the open pine habitat in the southeast, we're looking at the gopher tortoise, the gopher frog, the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, the southern hognose snake, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the same type habitats benefit all. And if we can get private landowners working with the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service to provide this kind of habitat, we're going to benefit not only those, but the songbirds that inhabit those, the amphibians and reptiles that inhabit those, the other game and non-game terrestrial species. So it's a real win for that landscape. And I think, again, being able to talk early and openly is the key to making that happen.
So, Nick or Gordon, I don't know if either of one of you from a state perspective have an idea about that. So the urgency brought us together, but I believe that there are other actions now we're working on that aren't being pushed because of either litigation or petition. And I would say, you know, some of the aquatic conservation efforts that we've talked about.
Well, this is Nick. Cindy, as far as the urgency in bringing us together, I talked about how there was momentum and traction. I think the petitions and the regulatory, the concerns about regulatory intervention here, I think that was more of a catalyst, more of a push things maybe faster. But most all the states, all of us were already working really actively through our state wildlife plans, swaps, and through the funding we'd gotten from that. We're already working actively to identify these at-risk species in our states at the state level, and we were actively engaging the service already in that process. And the planning process, like I can't overstate the importance of developing management plans for these species or groups of species or these habitat complexes that we deal with as a whole, because the planning process has pushed us to bring in our landowners and say, how can we plan for dealing with these species? How can we help you, help us, help get to these goals of keeping these species off the list? Those things, all this, that has all generated these engagement processes and the trust building even before mega petitions. And I really honestly believe we'd still be getting there without those petitions. And in some ways, the petitions and this is Nick talking, but those petitions and that regulatory, it actually took us a step backwards in some ways, because that puts a big wet blanket on the trust building at times. And I think we'd still be going down this road. So I don't buy into the notion that the mega petitions are what got us here. I think we were getting there already, and we were all coming together. Those just kind of added a whole 800-pound gorilla to have to deal with.
Well, this is Gordon. I've got a slightly different perspective on that, and I agree with Nick in that I believe the mega petition was an accelerator of sorts. But I think the products that emerged in terms of like the Sears program and even the support for CCAS as it's developed has been greatly emboldened by this sense of urgency. Nevertheless, I think that the partnership was there, and I do think we would have seen this development over time. But I do think this function and form that's emerged has really been a result of a need to wrap around a problem together quickly, and that's been one of the benefits. But as we move forward, now that we have these tools in place, and as we get this big slug behind us, I think these tools will be extremely valuable as we work across the Southeast, particularly in the Southeast that's dominated by private lands, as we build a patchwork of conservation using a much more strategic approach that's brought forward with these tools. So we have the byproduct benefit now that is a tool moving forward that isn't built on this sense of urgency anymore. It's more because it's a great way of doing business.
Thanks to both of you for helping with that answer. I'd like to go back to Salem and Jimmy, and one of the questions that we have is, we know from a Fish and Wildlife Service perspective that people wanted to make sure as they went forward, working with us together, that some of the conservation actions also had assurances that they would go forward with based on if the species did get listed. And I would say assurances or regulatory predictability of what would be required in the future. Are there limiting factors to getting over and above the need for assurances or wanting that type of assurance or regulatory predictability over and above those issues, Jimmy and Salem, as you go forward to work with us closely?
Cindy's looking at me, Salem, so I guess I'll go first. You know, I think every tool in the toolbox is important to somebody. I'll just speak for RMS specifically here. Some of the hoops that we have to go through to get regulatory certainty, to me, simply aren't worth it, particularly if we can have a memorandum type agreement, a handshake type agreement. I'm old-fashioned enough to still believe in that sort of thing between us and the states or us and the service. And you know, that's one of the beauties of what the state of Florida has developed with gopher tortoise. It's a very simple management plan that you sign a memorandum that you agree to put those practices in place, and there's a way to verify that that's being done. And Nick and his team have gotten an awful lot of acres involved in gopher tortoise conservation through something that simple. You know, oftentimes when it's an agreement that gets in the Federal Register and you have to react to comment, and particularly when there are folks who have agendas other than true conservation that are providing those comments, that's a real barrier for us. It's just the time it takes to grind through that process. Regulatory certainty is important, but I think we can get it. I think we can get certainty through other and better means.
Okay, thanks. Salem, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a little sidelight on this. I think that most private landowners, and I'm talking from a private landowner to smaller landowners that have the majority of the lands in the Southeast. And, you know, they may be 150 acres, 40 acres, whatever, but a lot of those acres are adjacent to other contiguous acres that make up a big part of our woodlands. And I think that from that standpoint, that most of the landowners, I would think, are really not concerned about this big regulation or this other regulation or whatnot, but what's going to happen to their own land and what affects their own property and their benefit of being able to manage their property without the regulations. I would think that once those landowners start doing some practice and management and they see the results and then they want to do a little bit more, they need to be educated a little bit more on how better they can manage their properties. If there's some way that even with the MOUs that we've signed that for 30 years, and I know from my relationship with Fish and Wildlife, I can call these guys or gals and they'll come out in a minute's notice and help me make a decision about something if I ask them. Most landowners don't think that way. They think that if they're going to call somebody to help them see what they're doing and give them advice, they're going to try to govern them and they're going to try to find something they're doing wrong instead of the benefit. We've got to get over that stigma, and it's about relationship and trust. That's where we all go back to that. And if in these MOUs, if they can get someone to come walk the land every once a year or every couple of years and just have a positive conversation and see the benefits that's being produced and get more advice, I think that will go a long way.
Thank you, Salem. We have another question that someone is asking about challenges regarding data sharing and collaboration between the states and the federal agencies as we're going through this process of these evaluations. And I'm hoping that maybe Mike Harris and Todd would be able to help with this as they work through things.
Yeah, Cindy, I'll start off. So Todd mentioned the data sharing letters that most all of the states in the Southeastern Association signed. And through that and through the relationship that we built, we've taken care of the policy and the agreement to share information. There's no issue outstanding there. We do still have technical challenges with different systems that are used among the various states in the Southeast, different systems that are used in our different field offices. We continue to work through the Wildlife Diversity Committee to address that challenge, but that's a big outstanding need that we have not totally solved, and I think that's something nationally that we need to work on. How can we do a better job? We're spending lots of money to gather good information about various species and habitats. We need to commit ourselves to making sure that information is available to actually be used to inform conservation decisions. Todd, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, you know, in my opinion anyway, it's really the responsibility for good data sharing falls to the states. We're usually the ones collecting the information. If we're not the ones collecting the information, we know who is. And we, I think, are probably best primed to make sure that information gets to our partners like the Fish and Wildlife Service. So just looking at my role as a state biologist, I think it really is our responsibility to make sure that information is gathered and shared with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you, Todd. I have one other question that will address. Nick, you mentioned the use of Section 6 grants under the ESA and the Section 6 grants, and I'm wondering whether or not you think that is being used. If we're utilizing the Section 6 grants and that part of the Act to the fullest potential to protect both at-risk and listed species?
Yes, Cindy, I think, well, let's just step back to Section 6 of the Endangered Species Act that is the most clear language you can get as far as pushing federal and state cooperation for implementing ESA. And then you step down, the grant is a vehicle for laying out ways we can better collaborate and build bridges to deal with species, particularly candidate species, and as we're trying to keep, work together to preclude listing. I do think there's more flexibility there. I think we need to push on those agreements more. We need to be more creative. I do get a little frustrated. There are some interests out there that just don't want to trust in having states to be a stronger partner, or even trust that we can leverage those flexibilities to work with landowners. And we got to work on that. That's where we all need to work better together to build that credibility with some of the broader environmental community. But I do believe there's a lot of room to push the envelope under Section 6. And Section 6 funding is an important piece of that. And that is an area, if I was asked, where I think we need more help, more funding, more support, and it does need to be more strategic. And again, you got to be careful there with, when you come from a state trust species to a federal trust species and how that money is used. But I do think that's an area that we need to really push on and think about, as far as where we can extend the flexibilities and the cooperation.
Thanks, Nick. Gordon, did you want to add anything about the Section 6 program?
Cindy, I think Nick pretty well covered it. I would say that he mentioned the challenges with the broader environmental community, and I would emphasize that really is a challenge, and that in some ways removes elasticity from the existing flexibility. So I would just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. What role has habitat mitigation programs played in supporting collaborative species conservation? And Mike Harris is going to start.
Yeah, I'll take a first cut at that. And I mentioned that the defense installations have many important populations of these species, and they're really carrying a heavy load for conservation of listed and at-risk species in the southeast and across the country. We've had some great success with the red-cockaded woodpecker and the military bases historically, and I think that's really one of the success stories of ESA that's not maybe as widely known as it should be. And the Army guidelines that were developed here in the southeast many years ago and made it clear that as an installation grew their population through the right kind of habitat management, through translocating birds, putting in inserts, doing all the things we knew to do, as that population increased, they got more flexibility for take on the installation in association with training. And when you can create that kind of win-win so that the training officer on the installation knows that the better that population is doing, the more flexibility he or she has to utilize the full assets of the base, then the next thing you know, you've got a tremendous program and they're doing great things for conservation. So how do we expand that out beyond those installations and work on other species and do conservation outside the fence line? And that's what we've tackled with that gopher tortoise conservation strategy, and I think that will be another tool for the Readiness and Environmental Protection Initiative programs, the military buffer programs. Their investments are not limited to that immediate area adjacent to the installation. If they can show conservation benefits to a species that might impact training in the future if it were listed, then they can put resources with other partners, and we've really worked with the states there, and that's, I think, key too, because they have the information about the best places to do those conservation actions. That species is under their jurisdiction now since it's not federally listed in the eastern portion of the range. So I think the state engagement in those programs is really important, using their knowledge and their authorities. I think building the right kinds of transparent systems to understand what the conservation actions will be and how that will benefit the species is important. And then having the funding through Department of Defense or other partners to actually do that is also important.
Hey, Cindy, it's Nick. May I jump in on this one?
Of course. I was just going to ask if anybody else wanted to.
Well, I just want to say a couple things. One, I think Mike really illustrated one point that I want to bring out that I saw. So we're talking to our Western friends, and we all know out west the federal land ownership is massive. I mean, I see statistics. Nevada is 85% federally owned. Utah, 65% federally owned, and we don't approach those numbers in the east. But what I don't want to miss is that point Mike's making too, is our federal lands in the east are a really important part of this mosaic of work on at-risk species. And I want to applaud Cindy and her team for their work with Department of Defense, Forest Service. USDA has been a major player through NRCS and others to bring together the way we can really bring in the federal landscape as a part of the solution here and as a big partner in this. And also I want to say, Florida, our experienced federal lands are really important. A lot of people don't realize that 13% of Florida is federally owned. We've got 13% of our entire state land is in federal ownership. That's not 85%, but it's still a pretty big chunk. So I didn't want to miss that point. And I also wanted to offer that states do have some creative mitigation programs at a state level working with private landowners. I've heard Jimmy mention our Gopher Tortoise program, and I just want to throw that out there if anybody wants more information. We've been really working hard on gopher tortoises for a long time in Florida. I know all the states have in the South, in the gopher tortoise range. We created a mitigation program that is pretty unique, and it's been interesting to manage. But bottom line is what it does is that if there's a developer, somebody that needs to develop, has to develop, and it's going to impact gopher tortoises, we now have a system where the developer has a certainty on what they have to do. If they need to move a tortoise, they have certainty on what that's going to cost. They can move the tortoise. They can get that permitted. They move it to a big piece of private land that's already signed up as a recipient site, a mitigation site. That private landowner, and in some cases we've got some timber companies that have signed up and big landowners. They agree, they provide a conservation easement and assurance that they're going to manage gopher tortoises, and those gopher tortoises then are moved to this private land where they're going to be managed and taken care of, and that landowner then gets a financial return for their willingness to do a conservation easement and manage gopher tortoises. So it's a win-win-win for how we do it at the state level. So a lot of things going on there.
Thank you, Nick. I think those are the questions that we have as we go forward. Again, I'd like to thank the panelists, and I truly appreciate the opportunity. Gordon, I don't know if you have any other thoughts for the summary.
Well, I guess, Cindy, thank you. I think I would just close on, you know, the tools that have emerged through this whole process. I think, to me, that really is important to reflect on that. And those are tools that support large landscape conservation, and particularly the CCAS tool, in which we're working with the LTCs, and the SEERS tool, which will help us moving forward, hopefully more proactively conserve at-risk species. That has been a byproduct of this whole Southeast partnership that I think is worth noting in closing. But that's all I have, Cindy. Thank you.
Thank you. Zach, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Cindy. So again, just thank you to all of you who attended, and thanks so much to all the panelists. I think it was a really great, insightful discussion, and as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, I think a perfect way to kick off this ESA Initiative Year 2 webinar series. So just a few closing housekeeping items. For everyone, look for a wrap-up email that's probably going to come early next week. It'll have a link to the webinar recording on YouTube, and then also a summary of some of the key discussion points brought up today. Also, you see our website down there at the bottom of the screen, so please feel free to check out our online resource library at westgov.org. We have some case studies up there. We have some additional resources that folks may find interesting. So again, just thank you to everyone. Thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to everyone who attended, and I hope to see everyone at some of the future webinars in the series. We don't have any to announce at the moment, but stay tuned because we will be announcing additional webinars as part of this Species Conservation and ESA Initiative Year 2 effort. So with that, I will sign off, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.